For weeks, people have followed every headline, every court filing, and every rumor surrounding Nancy Guthrie. Many believed the story had reached a point where there were few surprises left. Then one new detail surfaced. It did not answer every question, but it changed how many people began looking at the entire investigation. Around the same time, new developments connected to Nolan Wells and Tyler Robinson added another layer to an already complicated picture. Each update seemed separate at first, but when placed side by side, they began raising questions that investigators, journalists, and online followers could not ignore. If you have been following this case from the beginning, you probably know how often one small piece of information has shifted public opinion. A witness comes forward, a document becomes public, a timeline gets adjusted by a few hours. Suddenly people begin looking at everything differently. That is exactly what happened again. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has remained one of those stories that refuses to fade away. Every time it appears the investigation has settled into silence, another development brings renewed attention. Family members continue searching for answers. Reporters continue reviewing public records. Law enforcement has remained careful about what they release, choosing their words cautiously whenever new information becomes public. According to publicly available information, investigators have continued reviewing digital evidence, witness interviews, and physical evidence gathered throughout the investigation. Officials have repeatedly emphasized that some details cannot yet be discussed because they may affect future legal proceedings or ongoing investigative work. For many viewers, that has created both frustration and curiosity. People naturally want complete answers. Instead, they receive pieces. Those pieces rarely arrive in chronological order. That makes the entire story difficult to understand. To appreciate why this newest development has received so much attention, it helps to step back and remember how investigators reached this point. When Nancy Guthrie's case first captured national attention, many people immediately formed opinions about what they believed had happened. Some focused on personal relationships. Others looked at financial questions. Some believed the answer would come from forensic evidence. Others thought digital records would eventually tell the story. As the weeks passed, investigators collected enormous amounts of information: phone records, electronic devices, witness statements, surveillance footage, travel histories, financial transactions. Each category added information, but none appeared to provide one simple explanation. That is often how major investigations unfold in real life. Television dramas solve complicated cases within an hour. Actual investigations can take months or even years. Every document has to be verified. Every interview has to be compared against previous statements. Every timeline has to match available evidence. Investigators know that even a small mistake can affect the credibility of an entire case. Meanwhile, public interest continued growing. Online communities examined photographs frame by frame. People compared weather conditions. Others discussed possible routes, distances, and estimated travel times. Some observations proved useful. Others turned out to be misunderstandings. Throughout all of that discussion, investigators continued working behind the scenes. Then another name began appearing more frequently: Nolan Wells. At first, many people were unsure why his name was attracting so much attention. Reports connected him to portions of the broader investigation, leading many observers to wonder whether his role would become more significant over time. According to reporting available at the time, authorities and journalists continued examining how various individuals connected to the case might help establish a clearer sequence of events. That did not necessarily imply criminal responsibility. In many investigations, people become important simply because they possess information that helps explain the timeline. That distinction matters. Being connected to an investigation is not the same as being accused of wrongdoing. Yet public discussion often blurs those lines. Social media has a way of turning ordinary questions into sweeping conclusions before all the facts become available. Investigators rarely have that luxury. They must separate verified information from speculation. They must decide what can be confirmed and what still requires additional evidence. That careful approach can seem slow from the outside, but it is necessary. As attention surrounding Nolan Wells continued, another familiar name returned to public conversation: Tyler Robinson. His situation also generated widespread discussion, with many asking whether his updates somehow fit into the larger picture surrounding Nancy Guthrie. Some observers believed there had to be a direct connection. Others urged caution, pointing out that overlapping names and timelines do not automatically establish a relationship between separate events. That difference became increasingly important as more information emerged. Several experienced reporters covering the investigation repeatedly reminded viewers to distinguish verified developments from internet theories. That advice may sound simple. In practice, it is surprisingly difficult. When people care deeply about a case, they naturally begin connecting every new piece of information. Sometimes those connections prove meaningful. Sometimes they disappear once investigators verify the facts. Then something unexpected happened. A newly discussed detail began attracting attention across news coverage and online discussions. By itself, it did not appear dramatic. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden arrest, no shocking surveillance video released to the public. Instead, it was the kind of detail investigators often notice, long before anyone else appreciates its importance. Small, specific, easy to overlook. Yet once people understood where it fit within the timeline, many began asking whether earlier assumptions had been built on incomplete information. Records reportedly suggested that one portion of the established timeline deserved another careful review. That did not necessarily mean previous reporting was incorrect. It simply suggested that additional context might exist. Investigations evolve as new evidence becomes available. Timelines are adjusted, witness memories become clearer, or sometimes less certain. Digital evidence may confirm one statement while contradicting another. That process can completely reshape investigators' understanding without changing the underlying facts themselves. For families waiting for answers, those adjustments can be emotionally exhausting. Every apparent breakthrough brings hope. Every unanswered question brings disappointment. Imagine living through that uncertainty day after day. Each phone call could be significant. Each news report could contain the answer you have waited months to hear. Or it could simply introduce another question. People who have experienced missing person investigations often describe that uncertainty as one of the hardest parts. You want certainty. Instead, you receive possibilities. That emotional reality has remained present throughout Nancy Guthrie's case. Friends and supporters have continued expressing hope that investigators will eventually establish a complete and accurate account of what happened. Law enforcement has consistently asked the public to avoid spreading unverified claims that could complicate the investigation or unfairly affect individuals connected to the case. That request has become even more important as online interest continues growing. Today, information spreads faster than ever before. A rumor posted in the morning can reach millions of people before investigators even have an opportunity to respond. Once that happens, correcting misinformation becomes incredibly difficult. Many experienced investigators have said that false information can consume valuable time because every significant claim has to be evaluated before it can be dismissed. That slows everything down. It also creates confusion for families desperately searching for reliable answers. At first, the newest detail appeared almost routine. Some people barely noticed it. Others assumed it changed nothing. But reporters who had followed the investigation closely began comparing it with earlier public statements. That comparison raised additional questions. Did investigators already know this? If so, why had it received so little attention? If not, what does it mean now? Those are reasonable questions. That careful approach often indicates investigators are trying to protect the integrity of their work rather than satisfy immediate public curiosity. Still, one thing has become increasingly clear. This latest development has encouraged many people to revisit the entire timeline from the beginning, not because every previous conclusion was necessarily wrong, but because one overlooked detail can sometimes change how every other event is understood. That brings us to the newest updates involving Nolan Wells and Tyler Robinson. Viewed separately, each update seemed manageable. Viewed together, they created a picture that was far more complicated than many people initially realized. And that is where the story begins, taking another unexpected turn. That brings us to the point where the investigation became even more difficult to follow. Not because investigators suddenly lost their direction, but because several developments began happening at nearly the same time. Anyone trying to understand the case by reading a single headline would have missed the bigger picture. One report focused on Nancy Guthrie, another centered on Nolan Wells. Then came fresh discussion involving Tyler Robinson. Individually, none of those stories appeared to answer the central mystery. Together, however, they forced people to reconsider how they viewed the timeline. One of the biggest challenges in any high-profile investigation is separating coincidence from significance. People naturally look for patterns. Investigators do the same thing. The difference is that investigators cannot stop once they find something that appears meaningful. They have to prove that it actually is. That process is often slow. It requires interviews. It requires records. It requires evidence that can stand up to scrutiny. According to public reporting, investigators have continued reviewing digital evidence alongside witness accounts. That combination has become increasingly important because memories can change over time, while electronic records often preserve exact dates and times. Even then, digital records do not always tell the complete story. A phone may connect to a network without revealing who was actually using it. A vehicle may appear on surveillance footage without clearly identifying every passenger. A message may explain part of a conversation while leaving the larger context unknown. That is why investigators rarely rely on a single source of information. Instead, they compare dozens, or sometimes hundreds, of pieces until they begin supporting one another. In Nancy Guthrie's case, that careful comparison appears to have continued behind the scenes. Meanwhile, public attention shifted toward Nolan Wells. Recent updates prompted renewed discussion across online communities and among journalists who have followed the case closely. Some observers immediately interpreted those developments as evidence that investigators were moving in a new direction. Others urged patience. They pointed out that ongoing investigations frequently involve reviewing individuals multiple times as new information becomes available. That does not necessarily indicate suspicion. Sometimes it simply reflects good investigative practice. Imagine putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle. You may place one piece correctly early in the process. Hours later, another piece fits beside it. Suddenly, the first piece takes on a completely different meaning. Nothing about the original piece changed. Only the surrounding picture became clearer. Investigations often work exactly that way. One document that seemed routine months ago may become extremely important after another witness comes forward. Likewise, an interview that appeared insignificant at first may suddenly answer questions investigators did not even know to ask at the time. That possibility has kept many people watching every new update with remarkable attention. Then attention shifted once again. Tyler Robinson's name returned to the conversation. For many followers of the case, this was unexpected. Questions quickly spread online. Was there finally a direct connection? Did investigators discover something new, or were separate developments simply occurring at the same time? Those questions remain difficult to answer with certainty. According to available information, officials have not publicly confirmed many of the assumptions circulating online. That distinction matters. Speculation often moves much faster than verified information. A single social media post can generate thousands of comments within hours. By the end of the day, many readers begin treating an unverified claim as though it were an established fact. Experienced investigators know that public perception can become part of the challenge. Witnesses may unintentionally alter their memories after repeatedly seeing rumors online. Potential jurors may form opinions long before any courtroom proceedings begin. Families can experience additional emotional strain when inaccurate information spreads widely. That is why many law enforcement agencies ask people to wait for confirmed updates before drawing conclusions. Of course, waiting is easier said than done. Cases like this naturally invite questions. People wonder what happened during specific hours. They compare maps. They review photographs. They examine weather reports. Some even revisit older interviews to see whether certain comments sound different after learning something new. That kind of public interest is understandable. But another detail stood out. Several experienced reporters covering the investigation emphasized that timelines should never be viewed as fixed until investigators say they are complete. That reminder may seem obvious, yet it is surprisingly important. A timeline is not simply a list of events. It represents investigators' best understanding based on the evidence available at that moment. As additional evidence emerges, the timeline can become more detailed. Certain events may move forward by minutes, others may shift backward. Some entries may disappear entirely if later evidence shows they were based on incomplete information. That flexibility does not indicate failure. It reflects the reality of investigative work. One particularly interesting aspect of the recent discussion involves the role of seemingly ordinary details. People often expect breakthroughs to come from dramatic moments, a hidden recording, a surprise witness, a major confession. Sometimes those things happen. More often, breakthroughs come from something much quieter: a receipt, a timestamp, a photograph taken from an unexpected angle, an overlooked conversation that suddenly makes sense months later. Those kinds of discoveries rarely create instant headlines, yet investigators know they can become incredibly valuable. According to reports, one of the latest developments encouraged investigators and journalists alike to compare earlier assumptions against newly available information. Again, officials have not publicly explained every aspect of that process. What they have indicated is that the investigation continues to develop as additional evidence is evaluated. For Nancy Guthrie's family and supporters, every confirmed update carries enormous emotional weight. Imagine beginning each morning wondering whether today will finally provide answers. Then imagine hearing that investigators have discovered something important, only to learn that it raises as many questions as it answers. That emotional cycle has repeated itself throughout this case. Hope, waiting, another development, another period of uncertainty. Many families involved in missing person investigations describe that pattern as emotionally exhausting. Still, they continue believing that every verified fact brings investigators one step closer to understanding the truth. As public interest remained high, journalists also continued reviewing older interviews and previously released statements. Some comments that initially seemed routine attracted fresh attention when placed alongside the newest developments. That does not necessarily mean those earlier statements were misleading. Context changes. A sentence spoken months ago may carry a different meaning after additional evidence becomes public. This is why experienced investigators often revisit earlier interviews. People sometimes remember new details, sometimes they clarify earlier wording. Occasionally, they simply provide better context. Each interview becomes another opportunity to compare facts against the growing body of evidence. Meanwhile, online discussion continued expanding. Some people believed the newest information answered the central mystery. Others believed it opened an entirely different line of inquiry. Neither conclusion has been confirmed by investigators. Instead, officials have continued emphasizing that the investigation remains active and that evidence must be evaluated carefully before conclusions are reached. That careful pace can frustrate people following the story from home. Yet it also protects the integrity of the investigation. Rushing to judgment rarely helps anyone. Getting the facts right does. As all of this unfolded, one question quietly became more important than any other. If this newly discussed detail truly changes how investigators understand the timeline, what other assumptions might also need to be reconsidered? That question now hangs over every recent development involving Nancy Guthrie, Nolan Wells, and Tyler Robinson. The answer may not come from a dramatic announcement. It may come from another small fact that has been sitting in plain sight all along. And if that happens, investigators may find themselves looking back at the very beginning of the case with an entirely new perspective. By this stage of the investigation, many people expected one decisive announcement that would explain everything. Instead, what emerged was something far more familiar to experienced investigators. The picture became clearer, but it was not yet complete. The newest developments surrounding Nancy Guthrie, Nolan Wells, and Tyler Robinson did not produce a single dramatic answer. Rather, they reinforced an important lesson that often applies to major investigations. The truth is usually built one verified fact at a time. Looking back over the timeline, that pattern becomes easier to recognize. At the beginning, attention focused almost entirely on Nancy Guthrie herself. People wanted to know where she had been, who had spoken with her last, whether there were signs that something unusual had happened in the hours before investigators became involved. As additional evidence was gathered, the investigation naturally widened. People connected to different parts of the timeline received greater attention, not necessarily because they had done anything wrong, but because investigators needed to understand how every piece fit together. That is where names like Nolan Wells and Tyler Robinson became part of the public conversation. Each update involving them encouraged reporters and followers of the case to revisit earlier assumptions. Some theories became stronger, others quietly faded away. That is exactly how a careful investigation should work. Evidence should determine the direction of the investigation, not public opinion. One of the most significant takeaways from the recent developments is not the discovery of one dramatic clue. It is the confirmation that investigators continue testing every available piece of evidence against the broader timeline. That includes digital records, witness interviews, physical evidence, travel information, public records. Each source has strengths. Each also has limitations. A witness may remember a face but forget the exact time. A digital record may confirm the time but reveal nothing about intent. A surveillance camera may capture movement without explaining what happened immediately before or after. Only by comparing these pieces together can investigators develop a reliable sequence of events. According to public reporting, that careful process remains ongoing. Officials have continued releasing information selectively while avoiding statements that could interfere with investigative work or future legal proceedings. For many viewers, that restraint has been difficult to accept. People naturally want certainty. They want someone to stand before a microphone and explain exactly what happened. Real investigations rarely unfold that way. Instead, they advance through dozens of small decisions made by detectives, forensic specialists, analysts, prosecutors, and other professionals working behind the scenes. Many of those efforts are never visible to the public. Hours spent reviewing surveillance footage, days comparing interview transcripts, weeks waiting for laboratory analysis, months examining electronic devices. Those are not the parts that generate headlines. They are often the parts that solve cases. Another important lesson from this investigation involves the role of patience. Throughout the past several months, countless claims have circulated online. Some sounded convincing. Others spread rapidly despite having little supporting evidence. Several eventually proved inaccurate. That reality serves as a reminder that the first explanation is not always the correct one. Investigators understand this better than anyone. They are trained to challenge their own assumptions. If new evidence contradicts an earlier theory, they adjust. That willingness to reconsider previous conclusions is one of the strengths of a professional investigation. It is also why timelines evolve. The newest detail that captured public attention appears to have encouraged exactly that kind of careful review. Rather than treating earlier conclusions as permanent, investigators reportedly compared them against newly available information. Whether that review ultimately changes the outcome remains unclear. But the process itself demonstrates that the investigation continues moving forward. For Nancy Guthrie's loved ones, that matters. Every verified step represents continued effort. Every new review shows that the case has not been forgotten. Families often say they are not looking for speculation. They are looking for answers supported by evidence. That distinction has guided investigators throughout this case. It has also guided many experienced journalists covering the story. Responsible reporting often involves acknowledging what is known while openly admitting what remains uncertain. There are still important questions without public answers. What exactly prompted investigators to re-examine portions of the timeline? Will additional evidence eventually clarify the relationship between recent developments involving Nolan Wells and Tyler Robinson? Are there witnesses who have not yet spoken publicly? Could future forensic analysis answer questions that remain unresolved today? At this point, those questions remain exactly that, questions. Authorities have not publicly confirmed conclusions beyond the evidence already released. That uncertainty may feel unsatisfying, yet it is preferable to filling the gaps with assumptions that may later prove incorrect. History has shown that many high-profile investigations changed direction because someone resisted the temptation to settle for the easiest explanation. Instead, they continued asking questions. They continued verifying facts. Eventually, the evidence spoke for itself. Whether that moment has arrived in Nancy Guthrie's case is something only time will reveal. Until then, every update deserves to be viewed with the same balance of curiosity and caution. One confirmed fact is more valuable than 100 convincing rumors. That principle has guided investigators from the beginning. It should also guide those following the case from home. As new information becomes public, earlier assumptions may continue to change. Some theories will gain support, others will disappear. That is not a sign of confusion. It is the natural progression of an investigation that is still developing. For everyone hoping for answers, the recent updates provide one reason for cautious optimism. The investigation continues. Evidence continues to be reviewed. Questions continue to be asked. Most importantly, the search for the truth has not stopped. We will continue following every verified development as it becomes available, separating confirmed information from speculation so you can understand what has actually changed and what has not. What do you think is the most important unanswered question in Nancy Guthrie's case after these latest developments involving Nolan Wells and Tyler Robinson? Share your thoughts in the comments, but please remember to distinguish between confirmed facts and personal theories. If you found this update helpful and want future developments explained in a clear and careful way, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next report. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.